You're listening to the OnePeterFive podcast.
It is a real joy for us to welcome you all here. Habemus Papam.
Rebuilding Catholic culture, restoring Catholic tradition.
Hello and welcome to the OnePeterFive podcast, episode number 53. I'm Steve Skojek, and today we're going to be talking about some of the aftermath of the Amazon Synod. There's good news and there's bad news following the Amazon Synod. And I think that it's important that we start to break some of this down before the post-synodal apostolic exhortation, which is expected to come out before the end of the year. We're probably going to get it as a Christmas present, which is, just put it right in your stocking. It's going to be great that we're going to have another post-synodal apostolic exhortation to deal with right around the time of the holidays. So this is what I want to do. I want to look at a couple of pieces of the puzzle, both good and bad, in the tradition of what do you want first, good news or bad news? We'll do the bad news first, and then we'll pivot. But there's a lot of stories that are out there that are sort of difficult to tie together. And so I'm going to go through these kind of quickly. I'm going to have to read some pieces. I want to let you know that everything I talk about today, we're going to put links below the podcast on the OnePeterFive website in our show notes. There's a related links section at the bottom, so you'll be able to click through and read any of these things to explore them in more depth. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that I want to talk about is we're actually kind of doing a full circle on the Pope's comments about Christ's divinity with Eugenio Scalfari. So you may recall that way the heck back in the beginning of October, right as the Synod was kicking off, there was sort of this cloud hanging over the entrance to the Synod because Dr. Eugenio Scalfari, who you probably know the name, he is the 95-year-old editor of Italy's La Repubblica newspaper. This is a big newspaper. It's the most widely sold newspaper in Italy. It's very widely read. The Pope has said that it's his newspaper of preference, which is interesting because it has this bias, this socialistic, atheistic bias. Scalfari was known for being anti-Catholic in the past. There was a shift in policy, editorial policy at the newspaper when Francis was elected to the papacy. They've been on congenial terms. They've been talking and interviewing with one another from the very beginning. The first interview that came out was immediately controversial. That was back in 2013. That was the interview where Francis said things like, the greatest evils in the world are the loneliness of the elderly and youth unemployment. And there were just a few different things that were just, obviously, these are not the problems. These are not the priorities. So right from the get-go, there's been this sort of this scandalous and confusing relationship between Pope Francis and Scalfari, and Francis told Scalfari, I'm not even going to try to convert you. This is also where he first said that proselytism is solemn nonsense. He said he wasn't interested in trying to persuade Scalfari to become a Catholic, which is a weird thing for a pope to say to an atheist who's getting close to his final days. And so there's been this weird back and forth between them over the years, and Scalfari has said that even when they can't get together and meet, the Pope will call him on the phone and talk to him about different things. So he has all these conversations with Francis sort of cataloged in his head. And what makes Scalfari interesting and useful is that he is not a conventional journalist in terms of the way he interviews people. He doesn't take verbatim notes, if he takes any at all. I think he may take some, but he doesn't transcribe what's going on in the interview. He doesn't use shorthand. He doesn't use recording devices. What he does is he has conversations with people, and then he comes back and sits down and reconstructs the interview from memory, which is obviously a weird way of doing things. But it's very useful if, for example, you're someone like Francis who is protected negatively by the charism of infallibility, and you want to get some crazy ideas out there. You want to get your freak flag flying. What do? You go to a guy like this who is not going to represent you perfectly accurately. He's not going to quote you verbatim. So you can't be pinned down on saying something that you're really not supposed to say, because you can always have the Vatican press team say, well, that's not exactly what he said. That can't be considered a faithful transcript of the conversation. Well, obviously, we know this. We know it's not. That's the point. And so Scalfari has been useful to Francis in a number of ways. He's allegedly denied the existence of hell a number of times with his conversations with Scalfari. He has said the souls of the unjust will be annihilated. He's done a bunch of different stuff. I don't want to try to go through all of it. We've talked about a lot of it. We've written about a lot of it here at OnePeterFive. However, going into the Synod, Scalfari comes out and says, hey, by the way, I had this conversation with Francis a while back. It wasn't, in the last month or so, but it was a while back. And he told me that Jesus of Nazareth, once he became a man, was simply a man of exceptional virtue. He was not quite a god. That's a direct quote from Eugenio Scalfari. So going into the Synod, we have all these people going, what the heck? Is Francis an Arian? He's saying Jesus isn't God. What is it that he thinks? Some more perceptive people picked up on the fact that this was a little bit different than Arianism and a little bit different than straight-up denial of the divinity of Christ, but was instead a heresy that is known as the kenotic heresy, or kenosis, which is this idea. Kenosis it comes from a Greek word that means that there was this emptying out of the Logos. When he became man, he sort of emptied himself out, and under the heretical view, he even emptied himself out of his divinity. It was like he set his divinity aside, and he just became fully man, and that's it. He was underwent the abasements and the tortures of his passion and all these things as just man and not God, which is sort of the flip side of Docetism, which sees Christ as a very spiritual only creature. So looking at these two things side by side, there's a problem. And we had an article by Hilary White where she explored, with the help of a theologian friend, kenosis theology, which, depending on how it's interpreted, can be orthodox or heretical. In its orthodox form, she wrote, it's mostly a moral attitude to be inculcated in Christians, meaning that we must follow the example and not seek worldly glory. But in its heretical form, it is Christological, essentially Nestorian, dividing the second person of the Trinity from the man Jesus. So literally just separating God out. So you go back and you reread what Scalfari says that Francis told him, and he used these examples from the ministry of Jesus and the life of Jesus. I'm going to go back and just read what was originally said. So Scalfari said that Pope Francis has never spoken of the ego as the determining element of man. Whoever has had, as I've had several times, the fortune of meeting him and speaking to him with maximum cultural trust, knows that Pope Francis conceives of Christ as Jesus of Nazareth, man, not God incarnate. Once he has become incarnate, Jesus ceases to be a god and becomes man up until his death on the cross. The proof that confirms this reality and that creates a church that is completely different from others is proven by several episodes that are worth recalling. So he goes through what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane, and the apostles heard him pray to God with words that were reported as, he misquotes him, but it's, Lord, if you can take this chalice from me. So again, this is this human action of saying, God, take away this suffering. Another episode, says Scalfari, that is also well known, took place when Jesus was already crucified, and there one more time he repeated and was heard by the apostles and the women who were kneeling at the foot of the cross, Lord, you have abandoned me, which, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me, which, if memory serves, is actually taken directly from the Psalms, and it was a fulfillment of prophecy. I'm sure those of you who are more exegetical than I am will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that he was actually quoting a psalm. So when I had the opportunity, says Scalfari, to discuss these phrases with Pope Francis, he said to me, quote, they are the proof that Jesus of Nazareth, once he became a man, was simply a man of exceptional virtue. He was not quite a god. Okay. So everybody went nuts, for good reason, when this was originally said. And going into the Synod, this is what we had in our minds while the Pachamama stuff starts dropping, right? So we're seeing violations of the first commandment and idolatry happening in the presence of the Pope at a ceremony at the Vatican Gardens, bringing in a pagan fertility goddess on the one hand, and then in the back of our minds, we're thinking he just got done saying, or at least we just got done hearing that he had said previously, Jesus isn't even God, he's just a man. And red flags are going up everywhere, which is understandable. Pachamama, interestingly, kind of took over as everybody started arguing about what Pachamama was and what she wasn't. And that even overshadowed a lot of the garbage that was going on at the Synod about the ending of priestly celibacy and women's ordination and all this enculturation of Amazonian cultural elements into the liturgy and all the stuff that they were pushing for. All of it kind of got buried underneath the Pachamama controversy, which I suspect, I'm not sure, was actually not a purposeful distraction from what they were doing, but actually was an unintentional upstaging that they probably aren't super happy about. So now we come back this week, and we're full circle, and we have a new thing from Scalfari, who's going back to the same conversations that he represented before, and he's released a book this week. It was on Tuesday of this week. He released a new book, and the introduction to the book he also published as a front page article in La Repubblica this week, and he expands therein on the earlier quote from Pope Francis about the divinity of Jesus. Now, according to Scalfari, Francis says here, he, Jesus, was a man until he was put in the sepulchre by the women who restored his corpse. I don't know what restoring his corpse means. It sounds like zombie stuff, but I think what he means is prepared the corpse for burial. That night in the sepulchre, the man disappeared, and from that cave came out in the form of a spirit that met the women and the apostles, still preserving the shadow of the person, and then definitively disappeared. I feel like that was confusing. Let's read that one more time. That night in the sepulchre, the man disappeared. And from that cave came out, in the form of a spirit that met the women and the apostles, still preserving the shadow of the person, and then definitively disappeared. I think it's confusing because it's a poor translation. This is, I'm reading this off of Church Militant's website. When I prepared for this show, they were the only ones who had done a translation yet. But basically what we're seeing is Jesus the man died, and then the people who met with Jesus after he came out of the tomb were meeting with somebody who was in the form of a spirit, who preserved the shadow of the person, so I guess his shape and form. So we're seeing this again, this separation of Jesus from being the second person of the Trinity, of being fully man, but also fully divine. So Church Militant reaches out to the Holy See press office for comment, like you do. And they said that the press office was caught by surprise, that they were unaware of the new allegations, which I find very difficult to believe because, I mean, it was in a book. And, I mean, maybe they didn't know the book was coming out, but I don't know. I find that a little bit dubious. So Matteo Bruni, the director of the Holy See press office, told Church Militant, quote, as already stated on other occasions, the words that Dr. Eugenio Scalfari attributes in quotation marks to the Holy Father during the interviews he had cannot be considered a faithful account of what was actually said, but rather represent a personal and free interpretation of those who listened, as appears completely evident from what is written today regarding the divinity of Jesus Christ, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so here we have the I want to call it a lie, but it's actually a very artfully constructed truth that omits a great deal. So it's like the game is, well, that's not exactly what he said, you know. They're not saying he didn't say something very much like it. They're not even trying to represent what it was that he did say. It's just, well, those are not my words, okay? Don't put words in my mouth. That's not exactly what I said. You kind of did. You just, you know, it's not a transcript. Okay. So here we are, and we're back looking at this again to cap off the end of the Synod, which is, I think, a fitting bookend, all things considered. Deacon Nick Donnelly in the UK, who's my one of my Twitter wingmen. He's written for OnePeterFive in the past. He's a good guy. Been really just red-pilling hard on a lot of the crisis in the church and has become sort of a tour de force on all the stuff that's happening in social media. So he gives a quote to Church Militant that I think is worth reading. He says that the Scalfari claims about Francis's heretical beliefs are so shocking and the Pope's adamant silence about these comments so incomprehensible, we have to assume that this is an accurate account of their conversations. It's reasonable. I mean, as I said in a previous video, if somebody went out, I mean, people attack me all the time online. People write articles about me that are just bullcrap, right? They constantly misrepresent me. That's part of being a public figure of any stature, and I'm not nearly at the level of the Pope. People are going to say stuff about you that isn't true, right? But if you're the Pope, or even if you're me and you're just, a podcaster and a blogger or whatever, somebody says, yeah, that's Steve Skojec guy. He doesn't even believe Jesus is God. You know what I'm saying? The first thing I'm going to do is this. I'm going to get in front of a camera. I'm going to say, no. Actually, I do believe that Jesus is God. He's the second person of the Holy Trinity. He's true God and true man, hypostatic union, da-da-da-da-da. I'm going to tweet it out. I'm going to put it on Facebook. I'm going to put it on the website. I'm going to put it everywhere. Because I want people to know I'm not a heretic. And I don't think it's okay that, especially if it's somebody who I consider a friend, who I've met with a bunch of times, I've interviewed with a bunch of times, I don't want that person who has credibility because I've given him credibility by saying, hey, let's hang out, let's talk all the time, and I'll let you report stuff that I say, and I won't ever correct you. I want people to know, nope, he got this one wrong. Even if I didn't correct all the other ones, you need to know this one's false, okay? I'm not a heretic, no thanks. But he didn't. He hasn't said it. So Donnelly goes on. He says, the claim that Francis denies the bodily resurrection of Jesus takes us into an area of de fide doctrine. Every time we recite the Nicene and Apostles' Creed, we proclaim the bodily resurrection of Jesus. In the past, an ecumenical council would have been convened to condemn Christological heresies, of this nature. He says, Scalfari's claim that Bergoglio is a Docetist, someone who holds that Jesus only appeared as a phantasm or spirit, takes us into the territory of needing an ecumenical council to condemn him and uphold the Catholic doctrine of the resurrection. It's a big deal. It's a really, really big deal. So we are back to this again, and I just kind of feel like, maybe I'm wrong, but do you feel like it's all coming to a head? You can only say so many of these things. You can only do so many of these things. We've had a month of talking about a pope failing to defend the church from idolatry, of participating in idolatry, of violating the first commandment, of allowing churches within his diocese in Rome to display pagan idols and hold pagan ceremonies when the idols were pulled out and tossed in the Tiber River by the hero Alexander Shuguel. The Pope collaborated with the Carabinieri and fished at least some of them out, or at least he said he did, and then they were put back in some of the churches. We're in a crazy place. We are in bizarro clown church world right now. And all of it seems to be fitting together in a very disturbing way. So let's take that as sort of the backdrop of, do we have a pope who even, is he an apostate? Maybe. And file that away in the back of our minds. And then look at what the Synod actually set out to accomplish that had nothing to do with Scalfari, that had nothing to do with Pachamama, but had everything to do with an agenda to use the people of the Amazon as an opportunity to introduce changes into the church systemically. So there's a piece at La Croix magazine. Yes, La Croix is not just a delicious sparkling water beverage. It is also an international Catholic daily run by Robert Mickens, who is openly homosexual and not on our side. He's interestingly honest, however, in some cases. He's been critical of Francis at times, even though he's a fan. He's an intriguing figure, but very, very biased against our side of things. The title of the article is From Synodality to a Creative Pastoral Approach. This one I'm going to link both of the LaCroix articles I'm going to talk about today, but they are behind a paywall. I subscribe, so you don't have to. But there was I think a good summary at the beginning of this article about what the three things were that emerged from the Synod that were the most significant and the most controversial. So number one, Synod fathers recommended that married men who are already permanent deacons be ordained to the priesthood in some cases. That's number one. Number two, there was a request to go back and study again because they didn't get the answer they wanted the first time, to go back and study again the question of the female diaconate and ministries carried out by women, so that they can try to ramrod something through that's obviously going to be ridiculous and not non-sacramental, and I don't even know what it's going to be. Number three, the Synod Assembly's suggestion that the people of the Pan-Amazonian region be allowed to develop a liturgical rite of their own that better incorporates religious elements and expressions unique to their culture. So imagine we have the Roman Latin rite, which is schizophrenically divided into two forms that have nothing to do with one another, the traditional Latin Mass and the Novus Ordo. And then you've got the Melkites and the Byzantines and, all the different Byzantines, Ruthenian and Ukrainian. And, there's all these rites of the church, 21, 22, I forget what all the rites, and the number of rites. Ordinariate's been added, the Anglican use rite. So imagine an Amazonian rite where Pachamama is, invoked in the canon. So this is the idea, is that they need something that incorporates the religious elements and expressions unique to their culture. They weren't asking for it as far as I know, but we got a bunch of old white dudes from Central Europe who think that that's what they need. So let's put a pin, by the way, in the Synod for a sec. There is something that I want to bring up, and I forgot to pull it up before I started recording, so if you'll bear with me for a moment. Maybe we could put on some elevator music while I go to my Twitter and I look for the thing. Because I don't want to pause the video recording. Here it is. Let's see. Oh, yes. Oh, you're going to love this. So great. Okay, so Martin Barrias at LifeSite News. Story is dated today, yesterday, November 7th. But I just saw it for the first time this morning. Pope Francis denounces Amazon Synod critics as racist. Somebody suggested that the SJ after his name should be changed to SJW. Offering his thoughts on the Amazon Synod, Pope Francis excoriated certain circles and sectors who allegedly consider much of humanity a lower-class entity with scant spiritual and intellectual life. These unnamed individuals, the Pope opined, hope out of racism or bigotry to withhold the gospel. These comments came in an interview with Italian journalist Gianni Valente during the interviews were conducted during the recent Synod, and they were gathered into a book in Italian titled "Without Him, We Can Do Nothing." In the interview, the Pope said there are circles and sectors that present themselves as ilustrados, enlightened. They sequester the proclamation of the gospel through a distorted reasoning that divides the world between civilization and barbarism. Okay, you ready? Hold on to something. You may want to sit down for this one. Don't be drinking any coffee or whiskey, whatever it is that you use to get through this. Pope Francis said, quote, "The idea that the Lord has among his favorites many dark-complexioned people irritates them," the critics. "It puts them in a bad mood. They consider a large part of the human family as a lower-class entity, incapable, according to their standards, of achieving decent levels in the spiritual and intellectual life. On this basis, contempt can develop for people to be considered to be second-rate," he said, adding that all this also emerged during the Synod of Bishops for the Amazon. My goodness, this just goes on. I'm not going to read anymore. What a vile thing to say. First of all, Erwin Krautler, we have to call him Bishop, even though he doesn't act like one. Bishop Erwin Krautler, who was a long time from Austria in the Amazonian region, trying to cook up all kinds of diabolical things that he could do. He was so proud, he said, that he never has baptized an Indian in his entire ministry. He has never given baptism to anyone. Seriously, this is a guy, he's been in the Amazon region for centuries. He's an old dude. I don't know how long he's been there, decades. And he says he's never baptized an Indian. I assume he means an indigenous person. And then during the Synod, he said that celibacy was something that the Amazonian people couldn't understand. So that's why we had to get rid of it for the priesthood, because they couldn't understand it. That is racism. That's like flat out, you're not capable of this. We know what's better for you. We gotcha. We'll take care of it. It's good. When people say, hey, I don't think, because, God had this commandment that maybe we shouldn't do this whole pagan, Incan fertility, earthquake goddess deity thing in our churches, because traditionally when we do pagan worship, bad stuff happens. I don't know if you remember Moses and the golden calf, but things don't really go so well. And there were popes and stuff who they said we should destroy the idols. Pope Gregory the Great commanded that happened. There were some people, and they commanded some stuff. They had authority, and they said that idolatry was bad. And so maybe, I don't know, you could think about it. You just don't want to look like, as a bishop or a priest or a pope, that you're worshiping a false god. Maybe that's not racism. You know what that is? That's, hey, I actually believe in the stuff that the church teaches, and I'm going to follow it. I'm going to live it. So the idea that we don't want to incorporate all aspects of another culture. For example, in the cultures that worship Pachamama, there is a direct connection to human sacrifice. There is the killing of the old and of the very young under certain circumstances. We can link to that one in the show notes, but there's entire articles about how they're still killing people, and then there's human sacrifice, and there's, I don't want to use that under Sacrosanctum Concilium 38 and enculturation into the liturgy. I don't think that's a good idea. That doesn't make me a racist. That means I just don't think killing people is super great. I know it's controversial. I know. So it's not racism, and it's absolutely absurd. And obviously, the term is used to the detriment of actual racism, which really does happen. It's not racism to say, guys, the church supersedes all cultures and subsumes all peoples into the universality of one religion. And this is how it works, and these are the standards, and you have to wear clothes to Mass, and you need to receive the Eucharist with respect, and we kneel at this time, and we stand at that time, and we do all the things that we do. That is not racism. That's, I would like your souls to be saved, and it doesn't matter where you're from. And if you look at how enculturation really works, look to Our Lady of Guadalupe, who appeared to St. Juan Diego, who was of indigenous descent in Mexico. She appeared looking familiar to him and to his people, and her appearance led to the conversion of 8 million people over a very short period of years, and turned Mexico into a Catholic country from a human-sacrificing, serpent god-worshipping nation of Aztec warriors, basically. And what did she do? She's like, hey, I'm your mother too. Now come join this other thing and become enlightened by the religion that the true God established, because Quetzalcoatl is not a guy, you really want to hang with, because he's just the devil in another form. So not racism, very ridiculous to call this opposition to what's going on racism. But the Pope is a ridiculous man, and that's an unfortunate thing to have to say. So coming back to our 3 points. So celibacy, female diaconate and Pan-Amazonian rite of the liturgy. There's a couple of points that Mickens makes in his article that I think are worth addressing. He says that the people who are upset about these things, the Orthodox Catholics, he puts it in scare quotes, are acting like these things are novel innovations, while they clearly are not. But there is one thing these alarmists are dead right about, writes Mickens. The Synod of Bishops Special Assembly for the Pan-Amazonian region has marked an important shift. As Lacroix's Isabelle de Galmin, I am not good at pronouncing that name, Isabelle de Galmin noted perceptively in a recent article, this assembly, quote, clearly signaled the end of nearly 5 centuries, end quote, of Tridentine Catholicism. This is a significant point. They're saying this on the left, and that's why I'm pointing it out. Quote, we are still, consciously or unconsciously, largely dependent on this Council of Trent, which structured Catholicism around the figure of the priest, she wrote. The cleric, she continues, one single person then becomes the central character. He concentrates on his person all the sacred functions, starting from the Eucharist and confession. This concept of the ideal priest, the holy priest, identified with Christ, placed above the faithful and condemning them to be nothing more than a simple flock of docile sheep. Yeah, because where have we heard the sheep-shepherd metaphor? Oh, Jesus. Has deeply marked the mentality of all Catholics and has greatly favored the prevailing clericalism, including among the laity. So they're talking about how this synod marks a very significant departure from Tridentine theology. That's huge. Now, Tridentine theology in the sense of everything that came from the Council of Trent, not just the Mass that was codified as a part of what Trent asked for. The married male priests comes back up later on in the article, and he says, Mickens is writing here, he says, let's presume that no matter how long it takes, married priests will at some point become a normal part of Catholic life. And let us presume that many, if not most, of these married priests will have children. Some of them will be girls. And what will happen when the daughters tell their ordained fathers that they, too, feel called to the priesthood? Or even more significantly, what will happen when these married presbyters, gosh, they love that stupid word, these married presbyters and their congregations are the ones who tell the daughters that they show the signs of vocation to the ordained priesthood. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what they say or what they think or how their lady feelings are that day. Women can't be priests. Priests are alter Christus. Christ was a man. They cannot ontologically be priests any more than men can be mothers. Stop it. Stop it now. I want to talk more about a second article from a priest professor of canon law who did an interview with Lacroix, but we will get to that. I need to take a break coming right up. See you in a minute. Hi, I'm Steve Skojek, publisher and executive director of OnePeterFive, and I'm sorry to just pop in like this, I mean literally on your screen, but I just wanted to make a very brief personal appeal to you. You see, this month, like every month before, OnePeterFive is out there providing the best Catholic news and analysis you'll find anywhere online. And this month, like every month, we're providing that free of charge. There are no subscriptions, no obligations, no paywalls, not even one of those overlays that won't let you read the website unless you turn off your ad blocker. I can't stand those. At the same time, OnePeterFive is a 100% reader, listener, and viewer-supported enterprise. We cannot do the work that we do without you. And so I'd like to ask you, if you want to join your voice to ours, if you want to amplify your concerns about what's going on in the church, if you'd like to put your money where our big, loud mouth is, and it's loud for a reason, please stop what you're doing and go to onepeterfive.com/donate right now. It doesn't matter if you don't have much to give. Every bit helps us in our mission of rebuilding Catholic culture and restoring Catholic tradition. We'd like to thank those of you so much who've donated so far this campaign, and those of you who will do so in the coming days. God bless you, and thank you all for your readership and your support.
You're listening to the OnePeterFive podcast.
And we are back. Welcome back to the podcast. So we were talking about Robert Mickens and his article at La Croix magazine. He was discussing this end to 5 centuries of Tridentine Catholicism, of Catholicism rooted in the theology of the Council of Trent. There was a second piece at La Croix near the end of October that I thought was really important, and it was an interview with Father Alphonse Borras, who is a professor emeritus of canon law at the Catholic University of Louvain and vicar general of the Diocese of Liège. And he thinks that proposing to ordain married permanent deacons as priests is what he calls a minimalist pragmatism that avoids a two-frontal positioning on the issue in the face of opposition. So basically what he's saying is that he thinks that the approach that they took was because they knew they were going to get too much pushback, so they decided to be more subtle and only put just a little bit of the camel's nose under the tent. So he says in this interview, I'm going to call him Father Alphonse because his name is Borras, but it sounds like I'm saying Boris when I say it, and then you think he's Russian, but I don't think that is correct. So Father Alphonse, we're going to go with to avoid rolling my R's. Father Alphonse says that this proposal of ordaining men who are already deacons and married is of the order of minimalist pragmatism. One could expect, he says, that one could not ordain viri probati overnight or tomorrow. It was therefore necessary to look on the side of the permanent deacons, in other words, men who have already been tested for years in their interpersonal skills and know-how. Now, he has actually a little bit of a problem with this, Father Alphonse does, because he says it's going to actually deprive the diaconal ministry. I don't know what the diaconal ministry really consists of. I assumed it was there to supplement and help with the role of the priest because there was an insufficient number of priests. This resurgence of the married permanent diaconate, I mean, they do what? They do baptisms, they do homilies, they assist at Mass, and I don't know. I don't think they do marriages. Do they do marriages? I don't know. I don't know what they do. They can't do anything else. They can't say Mass. They can't do confessions. I don't know if they're doing sick calls. It's very confusing to me. Admittedly, I haven't looked into it. It's not an appealing position to me, but it seems to me that this idea that the diaconate would be deprived of something when these men can just become full priests, doesn't really make a lot of sense. But this is, so Father Alphonse has an issue with this. But he does think that the possibility of ordaining permanent married deacons as priests would lead to an exemption of celibacy for candidates for the priesthood. He says that the discipline of celibacy in the Latin Church for a millennium is a good thing and can't be changed overnight. But, he says, while keeping this common law of celibacy, one could consider the possibility of exemptions for calling married men to the priesthood. Asked who would grant the exemptions, he says, the bishops' conferences. So we're seeing, this popular theme of synodality and subsidiarity, even in places where it really shouldn't exist. And then he says, this is the key point that he makes, that this is a question of profoundly changing the sacred representation of the priest. In the imagination of many Catholics, Father Alphonse says, sacredness is perceived as linked to virginity and the absence of sexuality. These issues of sacredness and sexuality, therefore, need to still be worked on. So remember, going back to this idea of abolishing Tridentine Catholicism, it was at Trent that the consecrated virginal state was defined as being a higher calling, and anybody who said to the contrary was anathematized. So they want to raise those bastions as well, in the words of Hans Urs von Balthasar. So let's pivot a little bit here to the question of the Amazonian Rite. Now, I don't know exactly what they have in mind. There are people who are talking about Cardinal Sarah being the guy as prefect for the Congregation for Divine Worship who is going to be dealing with the study and implementation of any new rite. And there's a Spanish language publication, Observatorio Católico, A Voz de Todos los Católicos, which basically is excited because they say, hey, Cardinal Sarah's a good guy, and he's going to be in charge of this. There's two interesting things here. First of all, Cardinal Sarah's a good guy. That's how most people see him. And while I think he's overrated as a force of resistance, and I can explain why in a moment, there's no question that he's a good guy. And I don't know if anybody's noticed, but he's from Africa. And he has dark complexion, like really dark. And yet all the white people like him. It's weird because we're so racist. We're just so racist against everything in the church that we don't like, which is racist. So anyway, Cardinal Sarah, who against whom we are simultaneously racist and big fans, would be the guy in charge. This is what they think. But here's the problem. Cardinal Sarah, first of all, is... I think he's a very pious man, but I think that he is very much a man of the Second Vatican Council. He has discussed how the full fruitfulness of the traditional Latin Mass can only be discovered if it's offered according to the insights of Vatican II, which I completely disagree with. He has mentioned in the past wanting to see a synthesis of both the old and new rites. Don't want it. The new Mass doesn't have anything to offer the old one in any significant way. Let's not do that. You know what? I'm okay with updating the calendar, but no. That's just no. So there are some issues that he has there. But secondly, we have a precedent, a functional precedent for what kind of a problem we may face here with him standing in the path of an Amazonian rite. And that is, if you roll your clocks back to 2017, there was a motu proprio on the liturgy that Pope Francis released called Magnum Principium. A Magnum Principium basically did this thing that Pope Francis likes to do, where he's like, hey, you guys have heard of subsidiarity, right? Where the decisions are made at the lowest possible level, and it's a good thing, and it's a Catholic principle. Let's abuse the hell out of it, and we'll just let people who shouldn't be making decisions make those decisions at the lowest possible level so that we just have chaos. And that's what Magnum Principium was about, was saying, why should we have the Congregation for Divine Worship approve all the Mass translations? We don't need Rome, governing this universal religion that's supposed to be the same thing everywhere. We need to make sure that it's just a free-for-all and that everybody gets to phone it in from home, right? So Cardinal Sarah was like, hold up. So he says, there's an article, Edward Penton, October 12th, 2017, that Cardinal Sarah wrote in an article that the motu proprios changed to Canon 838, which shifts some responsibility for translating liturgical texts away from the Vatican to local bishops, would still require the Vatican to give approval to any such changes. And that was supposed to make everybody feel better, but 5 minutes later, Pope Francis came out with an open letter to Cardinal Sarah, not a private correspondence, an open letter saying, sorry, you're wrong. I really want this to be done the way that it sounds like. And that was very clearly a public calling out and a rebuke of Cardinal Sarah. And, it was noteworthy at the time that on Magnum Principium, Cardinal Sarah did not give the sign-off. There was an explanatory note associated with the motu proprio from the Congregation for Divine Worship, but Sarah's name wasn't there, even though he's the prefect, and that's who you would expect to sign it. Instead, it was Archbishop Arthur Roche who signed it, and some have described him as an ultra-liberal. I don't know much about Roche, but I do know that it's weird that he's the secretary of the Congregation for Divine Worship and Sacraments, and he signed it in Sarah's place, and that Sarah obviously publicly disagreed with the interpretation that was most obvious, and then Francis smacked him down. And then there was an Associated Press story on the Summorum Pontificum Congress that year, which was published just a week after the motu proprio came out, and it suggested an alternative reason for the missing signature of Cardinal Sarah, saying that he had been, quote, effectively sidelined by his deputy, end quote, who, quote, signed the explanatory note to Francis's new law allowing bishops' conferences rather than Sarah's office to have final say on mass translations, end quote. So it's interesting because this is the most directly connected example for Cardinal Sarah. Magnum Principium didn't necessarily anticipate new regional rites being formed, but it did talk about adaptations and translations that were going to be regional in nature. So an Amazonian rite almost falls under the auspices of this, based on the way I look at it. I could be wrong. But Sarah tried to push back on that and said, you know what, Rome's going to have oversight of this, and he would be the guy who would, he's at the top. And they did an end run around him, had his secretary sign the thing, and basically sidelined him, and then the Pope slammed him in public. And Sarah didn't push back because he doesn't. He's not a dubia cardinal. So I want to round out the bad news portion of this podcast, which has gone on for a while, with something that is not directly synod related, but it is directly related to the good news that I see. And I'll try to explain that. So there's a new survey from Pew Research Center, and they do a lot of surveying on beliefs and practices of Catholics. And they asked a wide group of people from different walks of life what they thought about couples who are cohabitating before marriage. And societally, it's not good, but it's what you would expect. Only 14% of adults surveyed said that they did not believe it was ever acceptable for two unmarried adults in a romantic relationship to live together. An additional 16% said that they agreed with it only if there were plans for the couple to one day get married, right? So you've got a total of 30% of people who either oppose cohabitation altogether or say it should only happen if they're planning to get married. So that's societally, which is not good. That's a minority, but I mean, that's what we see everywhere, every day. But religion did play a factor. Catholics and white mainline Protestants had nearly identical rates of approval of cohabitation. The survey found that 74% of Catholics and 76% of white Protestants who do not claim to be born again or evangelical, which is kind of a big caveat, but okay, were okay with an unmarried couple cohabitating. Conversely, this figure dropped to 47% for black Protestants and 35% for white evangelical Protestants. So, black Protestants and white evangelical Protestants are both more in line with the gospel on cohabitation than Catholics, which is, great. 74% of Catholics said, it's fine. You know what? We're good. Cohabitation, no problem. But this ties in to the data that we have in general on the difference between people who attend the traditional Mass and people who attend the Novus Ordo. Now, you may recall that earlier this year we published the results of a survey that was conducted by Father Donald Closter of St. Mary's Catholic Church in Norwalk, Connecticut, in cooperation with Brian Williams of LiturgyGuy.com, also a longtime contributor to OnePeterFive. Those two collaborated to highlight some very interesting data from the group of Catholics that never get surveyed, namely those who attend the traditional Latin Mass. The priest, Father Closter, who did the survey, has offered both the Novus Ordo and traditional Latin Mass for over 20 years and states in an introduction to his findings that he has observed variations between the people attending the two different masses within the Roman Rite. One presumes he sees that, within his own parish. Noting that American Catholics attending the Novus Ordo have been repeatedly surveyed in terms of their beliefs and practices by Pew Research and the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate at Georgetown University, also known as CARA. He also observed that the body of research does not appear to include a description of Catholics who attend the TLM, and they comprise an estimated 100,000 Catholics in the United States, attending at least 489 Sunday Masses nationwide. So surveys were taken both in Pew and online for a total of 1,773 respondents. Many of you probably received this survey. I know it got passed around at my parish. And the findings on key questions were informative, and they relate directly to this new study on cohabitation. So 2% of Latin Mass attending Catholics, and when I say Latin Mass, I mean the old Latin Mass. I don't mean Novus Ordo Latin Mass. TLM attending Catholics approved of contraception. 2% approved of contraception versus 89% of Novus Ordo Mass Catholics. 1% of TLM Catholics approved of abortion compared to 51% of Novus Ordo Mass attendees. 99% of TLM Catholics said they attend Mass weekly versus 22% of Novus Ordo Mass. And 2% of TLM goers approved of gay marriage so-called gay marriage, as opposed to 67% of Novus Ordo Mass attendees. So massive disparity in these things. And I don't know where they found 2% of Latin Mass Catholics who thought contraception was okay or 1% who thought abortion was okay. I can't even believe they were able to find that. Also of note was the rate of giving among TLM Catholics, which was nearly 6 times the amount of giving, at 6% of their income as Novus Ordo parishioners at only 1.2%. TLM Catholics also had a fertility rate of 3.6 children versus 2.3 for the Novus Ordo. It's always weird seeing the 0.6 and 0.3 kids showing up at Mass. You feel bad for those kids, but nothing you can do. You're a fraction. Indicating a nearly 60% larger family size. So, I mean, if you've gone to a traditional Latin Mass, kids just climbing the walls. It's a constant, people going in, people going out because they're taking out screaming kids because they actually care also about not being disruptive. So they take their kids out a lot more at the Latin Mass. And Latin Mass is usually, especially if it's a low Mass, is quiet. So it's much more noticeable if your kid's acting up. So, you see it all the time. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 kids at Latin Mass parishes, big families, young families, families where mom and dad are both there and the men are involved, not just, being present, but in parenting. It's not the blue hairs in the tennis shoes that you see at a lot of the suburban Novus Ordo parishes where they're all, boomer plus, they're in their 60s and higher. There's not a lot of future, frankly, that you see in the Novus Ordo Church. And, especially if you've really got 89% approval of contraception, and especially if you've got 89% approval of contraception, which is actually lower. I mean, I've heard 92% plus of Novus Ordo Catholics tend to use contraception. You're not going to be having as many kids. That's a huge thing. And then if you've only got 22% weekly Mass attendance, you're not even going to be seeing the people who go all the time. So what the heck? And all of this actually ties into one more disparate data point that didn't fall under either of these two surveys, which is the one that came out this summer saying that only 26% of American Catholics under the age of 40 believe in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. This was another Pew Research piece. Only 26% of Catholics under the age of 40 believe in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. It's crazy, but it's not surprising. But the good news, and this is where we make our pivot from bad news to good news, is that tradition is growing. Traditional Mass is growing. I actually saw a chart put up by Juventutum DC on Twitter the other day about French priests. And it was the number of Novus Ordo priests versus the traditional priests in France plotted out over a timeline. And the traditional priest line was this, if you're only listening, you can't see, but it's this steady increase going up. It's not a drastic incline, but it's just constantly going up, right? And then you look at the Novus Ordo priests, and it's, imagine you had a U, but then you cut it off at the bottom. Literally just a drop off of a cliff where it meets with the number of traditional priests, and then the traditional priests keep going up gradually but surely, and the number of Novus Ordo priests just continues to drop. That is the current data trend in France. And France is actually, they're pretty solid on the traditional movement. They've got some good stuff going on there. But there's a piece in the Washington Examiner last week, and the headline was, "Traditional Catholic parishes are growing even as U.S. Catholicism declines." So over the past year, parishes run by the Priestly Fraternity of St. Peter, a society of priests dedicated to celebrating the traditional Latin form of the Latin liturgy, have reported large increases in Sunday Mass attendance. I'm going to skip around in this piece and just give you a few citations. In Los Angeles, the fraternity did not even have their own church until 2018. But Mass attendance over the past year has doubled from 250 people per Sunday to 500. The parish's pastor, Father James Fryer, commented for the fraternity's website that after his parish added a fourth Mass on Sunday, another 200 people came. If you build it, they will come. But for real, if you build it, they'll come. They do. And they're coming more and more as stuff like what's going on in the Synod happens. And there's the connection. The Naples, Florida parish has been around for less than 2 years. This is the Naples, Florida apostolate of the FSSP. But close to 400 people attend every Sunday, an increase of 20% from 2018. The pastor, Father James Romanowski, I've met him. He's a cool guy. He used to be down in Mexico. Actually, I think he wrote an article for us a little while back. Told the Washington Examiner the parish has been averaging a new household, sometimes a family, sometimes an individual, every week for over a year. So this is a big deal. I mean, I've seen this at our parish here in Phoenix, and they're not cited in this article, but the numbers just keep going up. And our parish was already too small, so it's a problem for us. It's an infrastructure problem. It's a good problem to have, but our chapel just, it seats like 250 people. It's not a lot. It was small to begin with. So we have this overflow into the parish hall, and you end up having to watch Mass on TV if you don't get there super early to try to squeeze into the pews, especially if you've got a big family. Good luck getting a whole pew to yourself. You got to be there like half an hour early, and let's be honest, I have unruly kids, and we don't usually get there early. Somebody's always missing a shoe or having a conniption. So anyway, we keep seeing new families come, and they're coming even though they're having to go into the side room and watch Mass on a flat screen TV because they're feeling like they're not getting what they need in their normal parishes. And these are people who are coming. Some of them I've actually known already before they started coming because I met them through friends or through a men's group that I was going to for a little while. But they were going to the conservative, decent Novus Ordo parishes in the diocese, but they still didn't feel like they were being, to use the being fed enough, common term that people are using these days, that the kids are using these days. They felt like they needed more. And so they have started showing up. As the crisis in the church has intensified, they come. And one family I'm thinking of has 9 kids. Another one has 3 or 4. Another one has 5. So when you add them all up, it's like 40 people just between 3 families. There was one guy I talked to who just flat out told me he was in adoration and he felt like God told him he needed to start coming down. And he was like, I don't get it because I don't know anything about it, but okay, I'll go. And he's been there ever since. So people are being led to tradition. And the more things get worse in the ordinary church, the ordinary form world, the more people who care about their faith are going to be drawn to the refuge of tradition. Going back to the article, a little bit more on the stats. Sunday Mass attendance at the fraternity's parish in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, increased by about 29% in the past 2 years, while the parish in Atlanta has grown by 30% in the last year. The fraternity has witnessed a steady increase in the number of priests in the society since its founding in 1988, and ordinations continue to grow. Between 2007 and 2012, an average of 10 seminarians were ordained priests each year. Between 2013 and 2018, that number has jumped to an average of almost 15 per year. Annual reports provided to the Washington Examiner by the Society show the number of the fraternity's personal parishes has tripled from 11 to 33 in the U.S. since 2008. There's another section here. I got to read this part to you, and then we'll move on. In absolute terms, the Catholic population in the United States has grown from 54.1 million in the year 1970 to 76.3 million in 2018, although that is down from a high of 81.2 million in 2005. So it sounds like the Catholic population in this country peaked at 81.2 million in 2005, and now it's starting to fall again. In relative terms, however, the Catholic population has declined as a share of the overall U.S. population over the past decade, from 24% in 2007 to 20% in 2019. Okay, so 24% of the U.S. population was Catholic in 2007. Now it's only 20% in 2019. But get this, here's the kicker. The number of people identifying as former Catholics, people who've left the church, has skyrocketed from only 1.8 million in 1975 to 26.1 million in 2018. From 1975 to 2018, we have seen, just in America, the number of former Catholics, people who left the church, go from 1.8 million to 26.1 million. Gee, what happened right before 1970 that could have caused people to say, I don't want to do this anymore? Could have been, was it a council and a new mass? Nah, couldn't be. So tradition is resurging, and people are taking refuge in tradition. Tradition is growing slowly, steadily. It is still often under constraint in the diocese that it's in. But this is, again, tied directly to what's going on at the Synod and all of the crises that have been accumulating in the church over the last 6 years since this pontificate began. It is waking people up. And as they are looking for answers, they're finding that they're not in the church that they grew up in. And then they do the same thing that many of us did just earlier on and say, oh, hey, wow, look at tradition. There's all this stuff. Like, there's all these things that they were already teaching back in the old days that answer a lot of our questions about this. And they provide certainty and wow, that Mass, man, I am so sick of all the nonsense that's going on at my Mass. I hate the tambourines and the guitars and the women on the altar and the communion in the hand. I've never liked that stuff, and I've just tried to find the best Masses that I could, but those guys use altar rails, and only the priests give out communion, and they give good homilies, and they're waking up. And this is why I will encourage everybody within the sound of my voice. People who are traditional Catholics tend to be critical. They tend to be somewhat sarcastic. Well, at least maybe I'm speaking just for myself. We're good at identifying problems. It's how we figure this out. It's like, oh, there's a problem in the church. We should go to this other thing that's better. But sometimes we don't know how to rein in our criticisms. And there are probably people showing up at your Latin Mass, if you go to a Latin Mass. I know not all of you can, but there are people who are showing up at our Latin Masses, and they're going to look like they don't belong. They don't know. Maybe they show up in jeans and a t-shirt, and they're not veiled, or they're not whatever it is that you think they're supposed to look like. Don't give them a hard time. And if you're an introvert like I am, it may be hard to believe because you can't stop my mouth, but I'm actually really introverted unless I know you. And so I'm not the guy who's going to be the first one to come forward and see a new person and shake my hand and be like, welcome, because I'm bad at small talk and I don't know what to say. But if you've got that ability, try to help out the new people you see. Make them feel welcome. Try to keep your more outlandish opinions about things to yourself for a little bit until they get their feet wet, because they're looking for what we've got, and it's not ours. It belongs to everybody, and we just were lucky enough to find it first. So be gentle with the people who are searching and who are finding this, because I tradded, as we call it. I went traditional in 2004. And it was happening right at the transition of the pontificates between John Paul II and Benedict XVI. And so it was a kind of a cool time to do that because, at least on paper, Benedict XVI was so much more amenable to tradition. And he gave us some more on Pontificum and all this stuff. And it was like, when you go through and you read everything that happened during the council and what happened to the Mass and the number of people that left and all the just crazy revolution that was going on inside the church, you get mad. You tend to be really angry about it until you calm down a little bit. And it's kind of confusing, and it's like it makes you question everything that you thought you knew. Well, that was one thing to do that then during a time of relative peace. I can't imagine doing it now, during this pontificate when everything is going on and it's just so much more intense. So I think we need to be really cognizant of the fact that the people who are searching may actually be doing it. I read my way into tradition. They may not have done that yet. Maybe they just are like, I heard about this. There's a lot of trads on the internet. They got a lot of interesting resources. Whenever I try to look up what's going on that's wrong, I'm finding it on trad websites. And so they look up a parish and they go. And they may not know much about it at all. And it's daunting in the beginning. For most of us, it's daunting. So if you can help them, do it. That's just a little side note. But that's my little PSA. You can take it or leave it. So what didn't get talked about in the Washington Examiner article was the Society of St. Pius X. I don't know their numbers, but I know that they're good too. They also just came out with a communique from the Superior General of the Society about the Amazon Synod, and it's really good. It's really solid, and I'm really annoyed that nobody else, to my knowledge, has issued anything like it. So I'm going to read this to you because this is the stuff that we're looking for. It's dated October 28th, 2019, Feast of St. Simon and Jude, Apostles. Dear members of the Society, this is from Father David Pajlirani. Why do I have such a hard time with these names? Pajlirani? I believe it's David Pajlirani. I could have asked somebody in the society before the show, but I prefer to look like an idiot and just not be able to pronounce things. It's just better, just do it live. Dear members of the Society, the recent Synod on the Amazon was witness to terrible scenes where the abomination of idolatrous rites was played out within the sanctuary of God in new and unthinkable ways. And then the final document of this tumultuous assembly attacked the holiness of the Catholic priesthood, pushing for both the abolition of ecclesiastical celibacy and the establishment of a female diaconate. Truly, the seeds of apostasy which our venerable founder, Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, had identified from the earliest days as being at work in the council, continue to yield their putrid fruits with renewed effectiveness. In the name of enculturation, pagan elements are increasingly integrated into divine worship, and we can see once again how the liturgy that followed the Second Vatican Council is perfectly suited to this. In response to these events, we call on all members of the Society, including Third Order members, to observe a day of prayer and reparation, because we cannot remain indifferent to such attacks on the holiness of Holy Mother the Church. We ask that a fast be observed in all of our houses on Saturday, November 9th. We invite all the faithful to the same, and we also encourage children to offer prayers and sacrifices. On Sunday, November 10th, 2019, each priest of the Society will celebrate a Mass of reparation, and in each chapel the litanies of the saints, taken from the liturgy of the rogations, will be sung or recited to ask God to protect His Church and to spare it from the punishments that such acts cannot fail to draw down upon it. This is sobering stuff. Think about this. I'm droning on, so I don't know if you're still listening, but they're offering masses of reparation on this Sunday, and the litanies of the saints, taken from the liturgy of the rogations, sung or recited to ask God to protect His Church and spare the Church from the punishments that these acts of idolatry cannot fail to draw down upon the Church. We urge all priest friends, as well as all Catholics who love the Church, to do the same. Such is due to the honor of the Holy Roman Catholic Church, founded by our Lord Jesus Christ, which is neither idolatrous nor pantheistic. And then he signs it, and I won't read his name again because I'll just screw it up again. That is a fantastic letter. If the fraternities issued something like this, I haven't seen it. I haven't seen anything from the Institute of Christ the King. I haven't seen anything from anybody. This is what should be happening. It's not just, hey, we should pray and fast. It's specifically this Saturday, November 9th, fast and do it for this intention. All the houses are going to be doing it. We ask the faithful to do the same. Then November 10th, we're going to do masses of reparation in all of our chapels, litanies of the saints. This is the plan of action, attack. We need this kind of organized, structured response to what's going on and what has gone on in Rome. Because I just feel like I don't know. When everybody's left to their own devices, they just don't do things. I don't. Like if ever, we all talk about prayer and fasting. And then I go eat a cheeseburger because I'm like, oh, I'm hungry and it's lunchtime. I have to remember, on this day, we're doing this thing. And then it's like, okay, I can do that. At least until I develop, something like an interior life that would be admirable. So I think this is a really solid fruit of the council, not of the council, of Vatican III, the Amazon Synod, Vatican III. I think this is a really solid fruit of the Amazon Synod. So we see tradition is becoming the collecting place for those who are saying, I'm not doing this Pachamama thing. I'm not doing idolatry. I'm not down with all the crazy stuff that Pope Francis wants to do. I don't want to see women deacons. I don't want to see married priests. Traditional chapels. That's where you're going to go, that it's not going to happen, right? So we have this gathering place for everybody who's saying, no more. I can't trust my bishop. I can't trust the institutional church. I already have women all over the altar at my Novus Ordo parish, and I'm sick of it. I'm done with it. I'm going traditional, right? So we got that. You got the society coming out and saying, here are some concrete steps that we can take. Then you've got the bishops who are actually stepping forward. So Archbishop Vigano, who is a stallion, as we know, has just flat out said the abomination of idolatrous rites has entered the sanctuary of God. He gave an interview to Diane Montaigne of LifeSite News yesterday, I believe, and has said that this abomination of idolatry that's entered the sanctuary of God has given rise to a new form of apostasy, whose seeds, which have been active for a long time, are growing with renewed vigor and effectiveness. He says that it will cause an internal mutation of the faith that has already been taking place in the church for several decades, and that this synod has dramatically accelerated toward the foundation of a new creed, summed up in a new kind of worship. In the name of enculturation, pagan elements are infesting divine worship so as to transform it into an idolatrous cult. Clergy and laity alike, he says, cannot remain indifferent to the idolatrous acts we witnessed. It is urgent that we rediscover the meaning of prayer, reparation, and penance, of fasting, of little sacrifices, of the little flowers, and above all, of silent and prolonged adoration before the Blessed Sacrament. Archbishop Vigano says that he believes that the Amazon paradigm is actually aimed at fundamentally transforming the Catholic Church to align it with a globalist agenda and serve as a catwalk to ferry what remains of the Catholic edifice toward an indistinct, universal religion. This is sounding kind of antichrist-y. One world government, one world religion. For all of us Catholics, he goes on, the landscape in the Holy Church is becoming darker by the day. If this satanic plan is successful, Catholics who adhere to it will in fact change religion, and the immense flock of our Lord Jesus Christ will be reduced to a minority. This minority will likely have much to suffer, but with him it will conquer, he says, concluding his remarks with the provocative, prophetic, and timely words of the 14th century mystic and saint Bridget of Sweden. So we've got Archbishop Vigano, we've got Bishop Schneider, who did an interview with Michael Matt, and I want to show you what he said to Michael Matt that I found particularly inspiring.
And so I would say we have to have this confidence, even this inner joy in midst of the darkness. I know to whom I believed. I know to whom I belong. I know that I belong to the army of the winners, of the conquerors, because Christ is our chief. He is Christ the King. and we are all his soldiers, spiritual soldiers. And then we have Our Lady. She is she has a title. She conquered all the heresies. She destroyed all heresies. And so we are happy to be in the army of Jesus Christ, the King, and we are happy to be children of Our Lady, of our Heavenly Mother, who destroys all heresy. Our Heavenly Mother, who gave us her Immaculate Heart in these difficult times in Fatima, in her messages in Fatima, and she said, "This is your refuge. My Immaculate Heart is your refuge." And so I would say we will continue to love our Mother Church, not to abandon our Mother Church, to implore the divine intervention in due time, in the time which God knows.
Now, Bishop Schneider goes on to say that we are the best friends that Pope Francis has. And we're his best friends because we oppose him when he's wrong, and we pray for him, and we pray for his soul. And if all of us are praying for him, and if all of us are praying for him to be true to the spirit of St. Peter, he's got a shot at finding the truth, because, as Bishop Schneider says, he's going to go to judgment, and he's going to have to answer for these things. We have Father Mitch Pacwa, who is a Jesuit, who is an EWTN guy, out there talking about Pachamama worship. And, I don't follow Father Pacwa, but I believe he's a bit of an expert on some of the occult stuff that goes on. He says that in Peru, Catholics there have actually connected worship of Pachamama with a devastating earthquake that happened. And it caused this mudslide, and it wiped out the town. He kind of tells this whole story. Again, I'll link to the video. But basically that they remembered that this is what happens when people abandon the worship of Christ and worship false gods, is that, this is what you get. And, there's this we live in this weird world of rational empiricism, right? And we don't see a lot of the spooky stuff happening, so to speak. I mean, anybody who's had any experience with the demonic, I have, and I've worked for an exorcist, and I've seen some stuff that's pretty hard to explain. I've perceived some things that are, the perception of evil is very strong. But we don't have this sort of ancient pagan view of thunder and lightning and earthquakes and all these things are associated with divine retribution. I mean, yes, it can happen, but it doesn't. Like, Francis should have been struck by lightning 100 times by now. He hasn't been. Yes, St. Peter's was struck when Pope Benedict resigned, and maybe that meant something, and maybe it didn't. Maybe it was just a coincidence, because that's what the word means. I don't know. But if you expect signs from the heavens, and if you expect supernatural prompting of natural disasters that come as a consequence of these things, and by the way, I will say there was an earthquake in Rome yesterday, but it wasn't a big one. It was only like a 4.4 on the Richter scale, but hey, it's like a wake up. But I think we're past wake up point. Like, I expect an earthquake so big that a fault opens up in the earth and St. Peter's Basilica is split in two to show that the church is split. I mean, this is actually what happened in Assisi after the Assisi gatherings in the 1980s. There was a devastating earthquake, and the Basilica was heavily damaged to the extent that when I was there in 1999, as part of my Steubenville semester in Austria, we went to Assisi, and the Basilica still wasn't open, and the castle up on top of the mountain still wasn't open because they were still doing repairs from earthquakes that had happened years prior. So, but I don't know. I'm looking for that stuff. Like, are we going to start seeing signs and wonders? Is that really going to happen? How much hope should we pin on it? I tend to feel disappointed when, when the meteor doesn't hit Rome. I kind of wait for it. I want to wake up in the morning and be like, oh yeah, everything's on fire. That makes sense because God's mad. But God doesn't necessarily work that way. And I think sometimes we'd like him to, and then other times we wouldn't, because, man, do I not want to get punished that way every time I mess up. So I don't know what to think. I kind of like being able to get to confession rather than getting pelted with meteorites. I probably deserve the meteorites, though. So all of this stuff, though, taken together, I don't know. I see signs of hope. I'm seeing that more and more people are standing up and pushing back. If you've been following us for a long time, you may remember what it was like in 2013 when you couldn't talk about this stuff. I wrote my first very critical piece about Pope Francis in October of 2013, and it got a lot of attention because it was so out of the ordinary. I mean, I actually got interviewed by the New York Times and NBC News, and I was getting requests for media all over the world. And I started turning it down because I thought, and you're going to laugh at this, but I thought, I don't want to be the Catholic guy who's known for being critical of the Pope, because it was kind of a new thing to do that. And I held that line for a little while before I was like, I have to keep doing this. And if that's what I get known for, then that's what I get known for, because what's happening is wrong. But at the time, you couldn't say that stuff without massive pushback. And there weren't a lot of people doing it. You know, there were traditionalist outlets that were actually talking about the problems and the pontificate from the get-go, because they were there. I mean, they were baked right in from the beginning. I started OnePeterFive. Obviously, the Remnant guys were always on this stuff and have been for a million years. Rorate Caeli was the first to come out and say, this guy's a disaster. I mean, like the night of his election, they were on it. I'm trying to think. Catholic Family News. Catholic Family News was there because they've always been there. But I don't know of anybody else who was doing it. LifeSite News dragged their feet, I think, to the party a little bit. They started covering it early on, but then they got cold feet about some of that coverage when they got pushback. And it took a while before they got there. And now they're fantastic. I mean, they're leaders on this stuff. Church Militant actively attacked those of us who were doing it and called us spiritual pornographers and refused to have anything to do with us and blacklisted people like, me. We still don't have a good relationship because of it, because it was really aggressive. Things have turned a corner, and now everybody seems to be on the same page. Taylor Marshall showed up out of nowhere and wrote this book, and now he's everywhere that you look, and his podcast somehow has 100,000 subscribers, probably because he does it consistently, unlike me. But there's so many people now on this page saying, we're not going to take this anymore. We're going to push back. We're going to fight back. We've got friggin' 6'8" Alexander Shuguel, who shows up in Rome, goes home to Austria, thinks about it, comes back, takes the Pachamama idols out of Saint Maria and tosses them in the Tiber. And he's a hero. I mean, the guy is a hero now. And he has inspired countless Catholics around the world to fight back. And he's a nice guy. He's not an angry jerk. I mean, watch his interviews. He's a good man. You can tell. I don't know. I just think this stuff, like, yes, there's more bad on paper. You know what? Let's draw this thing to a conclusion, shall we? I think that I've gone on long enough. But the takeaway is there is more bad news on paper than good, officially. But it's not the whole story. Every one of the synods that Pope Francis has had has been a clarifying event for the church. He is, sometimes I call him Pope Smelling Salts, because he just was waking up everybody who's asleep. And every time they do something like this stuff, the battle lines become more clear. I don't think it was one of the intended themes of the synod, like I said at the beginning, to have the idolatry surrounding Pachamama be the central focus that everybody paid attention to. But it wound up being the thing. It overshadowed everything else they were trying to do, and it was a more powerful rallying cry than many things could have been, because it was so blatant, even if it was banal and silly. I mean, these ridiculous idols that just look like a failed kindergarten art project. You expect your idolatry to be a little more nefarious than that. And in a way, maybe that's what makes it more dangerous, because it's subtle. But Catholics who were sitting on the fence, even until now, to this 11th hour, were like, I'm done. I'm not taking this anymore. So if I had to make an assessment, I would say it seems like we're escalating quickly toward a battle to the death between modernism and true Catholicism. And by true Catholicism, I mean that strand of Catholicism that's rooted in the traditions of the church, that's rooted in her ancient liturgy, her devotions, her sacraments, the messages and warnings that have come to us through approved apparitions like Fatima and Akita and La Salette and Our Lady of Good Success. You're seeing a lot of these things coming up, right? These are the players. You've got modernism, which is a word that I think almost gets used too much, and it's worn out some of its efficacy. And it's also really broad in scope. Anybody who's doing something that's heterodox that we don't like, people tend to say, it's a modernist. But modernism was a word that was designed, Pope Pius X said it was the synthesis of all heresies. So by its very nature, it's a large tent. And I think that it encompasses everything from these recycled Christological heresies that are coming back up. I mean, look, we're talking about Docetism and Nestorianism, and we're talking about Arianism, and I wouldn't be surprised if I see monothelitism make a comeback. So we have these recycled Christological heresies. We have the infiltration of Freemasonic principles, if not Freemasonic agents, into the church. We have the infiltration of occult elements into the church and occult activities and behavior that are going on. So modernism is the label that, most broadly speaking, seems to accurately represent the anti-church that is coterminous. It's coexisting within the actual structure of the Catholic Church. And so if you look at how ancient so many of these things are, the only kind of Catholicism that can fight this weird amalgam of all of Christianity's ancient enemies is the Catholicism that's rooted in history. It can't be Catholicism of just the last half century, which so many people have tried to act as though that's all there is. No matter how conservative the ethos of post-conciliar Catholicism is, the post-conciliar church is a product of modernist influences. Full stop, hands down. Modernists planted time bombs and weaponized ambiguity in the Second Vatican Council. And the statistics that we've been looking at just in this episode show post-conciliar Catholicism is a manifest failure. It doesn't have a future. It's ending. It's collapsing right in front of our eyes. There are no positive trend lines, especially in the first world, but even the third world, I hear from people that say there's numbers, but they're not really, there's no depth. It's broad, but not deep. Post-conciliar Catholicism is a failure, and it can't combat the enemies that have infiltrated. We've got over 1 billion people in the world who call themselves a Catholic in 2019. But how many of them actually are? I mean, any meaningful sense of the term. Do they go to Mass every Sunday and Holy Day? Do they follow the church's teaching on contraception? Which is very basic, but it seems the vast majority of people do not. Where do they stand on abortion? Where do they stand on, the growing epidemic of gay marriage and gay issues? Do they go to confession when they fall? Are they living in adulterous relationships and still receiving communion? Are they receiving communion without going to confession in the first place? I mean, we all should be going to confession frequently if we're receiving communion. Have they been catechized in the true teachings of the church, and then do they actually live those in any honest way? And then, if you want to take those questions and say, okay, no, the answer is probably less than 10% of Catholics in the world, you could actually say, yeah, they do all that stuff they're supposed to do. Well, 10%? What is that, 100 million people around the world? Is that too generous of a number? And then you take that 100 million and you distill it down again and you say, how many of them, even though they're doing all the right things, have only been given the last half century of Catholicism as that's it, that's the whole religion, and they're not ever being taught the things that were in the Baltimore Catechism or the Roman Catechism from Trent. They're not exposed to the traditional liturgy. They're not exposed to the traditional sacraments. They weren't given the exorcisms at baptism. They don't have, the traditional devotions. They don't know the depth and the richness of the church that is at their disposal to combat this stuff that's going on. We're in a bad place. But the hope is that all of the extraneous, I don't want to ever refer to people as extraneous, but we can't evangelize people who think that they're already part of the religion, and they're not. So as they're being stripped away by the sex abuse scandals and all the stuff that's going on, the sex abuse scandals and all the stuff that's going on, and they're not going to Mass, and they're just not really showing up anymore, and they don't believe in any of this stuff, they're falling away, and the core of Catholicism is what's going to be left. And the churches are being closed down. There are hundreds of churches in the West, maybe thousands, that are beautiful, and they're not sustainable because there's nobody in them. There's nobody going to Mass. There's nobody to pay for them, and they're just being demolished, or they're being turned into, I saw some church, I forget where it was, I think it was up in Canada, beautiful church, turned into a Buddhist temple. Or they're turned into nightclubs, or they're turned into whatever, because churches you would just give your right leg to be able to go to Mass in, and because they're gorgeous and they were made for the Mass of all ages, and they're just being demolished or sold off. We are going through a winnowing right now, and this battle continues between the forces of good and evil, and the battleground is the church herself. We're fighting for the soul of the mystical bride of Christ, and we can't do it on our own. Bishop Schneider is right. We are in Christ's army, but there just aren't enough of us here on earth. So we need the teachings of the good popes of the past, and we need the intercession of the saints, and we need the angels on our side. We need the entire corpus of the church's theological teaching. The church militant is outnumbered. We need the aid of the church triumphant, and we need everything we've got in our history books and our bag of tricks from the last 2,000 years. We have to draw on the strength of the past, on what Chesterton would call the democracy of the dead. We need to call especially, in these times, on Our Lady, Virgin most powerful, destroyer of heresies, mother of the church, and our mother who prays and intercedes for us always. And as much as we may want normal lives, to stop looking at all this stuff, to stop thinking about it, to stop fighting it, to just go back to something that resembles sanity, I think we've got to be ready to keep fighting indefinitely. Because we're it, ladies and gentlemen. We are the last bastion. There is nobody else who is going to stand for our faith. Humanly speaking, we're the last line of defense. So stand firm. Until next time, I'm Steve Skojek. Thank you for listening. Please make sure you like, subscribe, review, recommend these podcasts so that more people can find them. God bless you. We'll see you next time. Hey, everyone. So it is late Friday night here for me, early Saturday for many. Just an addendum to the podcast. A couple of hours ago, I received an email that I actually just saw from His Excellency Bishop Athanasius Schneider, who passed along a prayer of reparation for the idolatrous acts during the Synod for the Amazon. I think this is an important prayer. I'm going to include it in the notes of the podcast here. I'm not going to read it all right now. Just going to share that with you so that you can use it. But I encourage you, if you're going to be observing the day of prayer and reparation today that was recommended by the Society of St. Pius X, they invited all Catholics in solidarity to join them in offering prayer, penance, and reparation for the idolatry that was committed in Rome during the Synod. I think this would be a really powerful thing for us to do. I think more than any video that we can make, I think more than any letter we can write, any petition we can sign, we have to remember that it's our prayers and our penances and our supplications to God that are going to have efficacy in calling down upon our troubled church His mercy and the grace of conversion for those who are open to receive it, those who are involved in these acts. Miracles happen. Miracles happen all the time. People can be converted. Damascus moments can be had. I've read this prayer. It's excellent. I will also be including it in a separate post that's specifically just about the day of prayer and reparation. Technically today, for most of you, November 9th, 2019. And then also remember, please, to offer your Holy Communions and your Masses this Sunday, November 10th, for the same intentions. I think it would be a very powerful thing for us all to be praying in solidarity with one another. Think about it. It's a universal church, and we all kind of have a tendency to do our own thing. But having a day, 2 days to actually do this together, united, is very powerful. And I think it would be pleasing to God. So I hope that you'll join me in doing that. Thank you. God bless you.